The morning of the auction, there were 150 turkeys nobody wanted. They stood in a wire pen at the back of the Miller's Creek livestock yard, panting in the July heat, their bare heads pink and blistered, their feathers dulled with dust from the long trailer ride. A hand-painted sign leaned against the pen. Broad-breasted whites. Wrong season. Best offer. The men gathered along the rail looked at the birds the way you look at somebody else's mistake, with a kind of comfortable pity that made them feel wiser by comparison. It was the third week of July in the year the drought came early, and nobody in 3 counties raised turkeys in July. You raised them in the spring, so they were finished by Thanksgiving, and if you had missed the spring, you waited. You did not buy 150 poults at the wrong end of the calendar from a hatchery that had gone under and dumped its stock at fire sale weight. You did not stand in the sun with your hands in your back pockets and study them like they were a puzzle worth solving. But Hannah Wren did. She stood at the rail in a faded green work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and she looked at those birds for a long time without saying anything. She was 24 years old, home 8 months from 4 years in the Army, and she had the kind of stillness the men at the rail did not know what to do with. Wallace Coburn, who owned 400 acres of good bottomland east of town and considered himself the practical conscience of the county, spat into the dust and said loud enough for her to hear, "That girl is about to buy herself a freezer full of regret." Somebody laughed. Somebody else said she'd be feeding them out of her own pocket clear till Christmas and lose money on every pound. Hannah did not turn her head. She raised one finger to the auctioneer when the bidding opened at $50 for the lot, and when nobody countered, she raised it again at $75 to make it feel like a real sale, and the gavel came down at $75 for 150 living birds, and Wallace Coburn laughed out loud and told the man next to him she had just paid 50 cents apiece for 150 problems. If you're enjoying this so far, do me a small favor and hit that like button. Drop your city or town in the comments so I know where you're watching from. And if stories about quiet people proving loud people wrong are your kind of thing, go ahead and subscribe. Now, let's begin. Hannah had not come home to Ashe County because she had a plan. She had come home because her grandmother Inez was 81 years old and living alone on the ridge farm the Wren family had held since 1897. And because the last letter Inez had written her in Kuwait had been 3 sentences long and one of them said the pump house roof was leaking and she supposed she would get to it. Hannah had read that letter twice and put in for separation the same week. She drove up the gravel road on a cold Tuesday in November with a duffel bag and a foot locker in the bed of a truck that had already begun composing its own obituary somewhere under the hood, and Inez had met her at the porch in a canvas barn coat and a pair of men's work boots she wore without self-consciousness because she had earned the right. And she had looked Hannah up and down once and said, "You're thinner." Then she had gone back inside to put on coffee. That had been the welcome. The farm sat on a south-facing slope above a creek called Little Bear. 140 acres of pasture gone to broom sedge, 20 acres of standing hardwood, and a scatter of outbuildings that had been built by Hannah's great-grandfather, Elias Wren, in the years after he came back from France in 1919. The main barn leaned 4 degrees off true, and had leaned that way since Hannah was a child. There was a spring house still cold enough to keep milk. There was a smokehouse Inez had not used in a decade, and behind the smokehouse, tucked into a bank so its back wall was earth and its front wall was hand-cut field stone, there was a low stone building nobody in town remembered the purpose of, with a heavy oak door and a chimney and a floor of packed clay swept smooth. Hannah had asked about it once as a girl, and Inez had said, "That was your great-grandfather's. He had ideas." That first winter home, Hannah did what returning soldiers do when they have nowhere particular to be. She patched the pump house roof. She rehung the barn door. She cut and split 4 cords of oak and stacked them against the east wall of the house in a run so straight, Inez walked out and looked at it and said, "Well." which from Inez was praise close to embarrassment. Hannah slept in her childhood room under a quilt her grandmother's mother had pieced from feed sacks in 1943, and she rose before light and drank her coffee standing at the kitchen window watching the ridge come out of the dark. And she did not talk much because she had spent 4 years in places where talking was the least useful thing a person could do. Inez seemed to understand that. Inez had lost her husband Coleman in 1998 and had run the farm alone for 26 years and had gotten used to the sound of one person moving through a house, and she made room for a second silence without complaint. In the evenings they sat at the kitchen table, and Inez read the county paper, and Hannah read whatever came in the mail. And once a week, Inez would look up over her reading glasses and offer some observation she had been saving. "The Hollifield boy has finally married that girl from Boone," she would say. Or, "They are going to close the elementary school in West Jefferson, mark my words." Hannah would nod and file the information away, because she was learning the county again, the way you learn a language you spoke as a child and let go rusty. By March, she had cleared the broom sedge from 30 acres of the south pasture and repaired 2 miles of woven wire fence, and she had begun to think, in the way a person begins to think without admitting it yet, about what the farm could be. She had $11,000 in savings from her enlistment and a small monthly disability check for a knee that had gone bad in a training accident. And she had no debt and no dependents and no clear reason to be anywhere on any particular day. What she did not have was a plan. What she had instead was attention. She walked the property in the mornings and looked at things. She looked at the way the spring house stayed cold in April. She looked at the stone building behind the smokehouse and noticed that its chimney had a damper hand forged into the flue. She looked at the old orchard on the west slope where 12 apple trees Elias Wren had planted 100 years ago still bore fruit nobody picked. And one evening in early May, when the peepers were loud down at the creek and Inez was mending a shirt at the kitchen table, Hannah asked her about the stone building. Inez did not look up from her needle. "That was your great-grandfather's smoke chamber," she said. "He built it the year he came home from the war. He had learned something over there about curing meat slow and cold, and he never got over it. What did he cure? Anything he could get his hands on, pork mostly. Some beef. One year he tried a turkey, and your great-grandmother said it was the best thing she ever put in her mouth, and he wrote it down." "Wrote it down where?" Inez finally looked up. "In that green ledger in the parlor," she said, "the one on the bottom shelf. He wrote everything down. He was that kind of man." Hannah found the ledger that night. It was bound in cracked green cloth, and the spine had been mended twice with waxed thread, and the pages inside were filled with the small, careful handwriting of a man who had been taught penmanship in a one-room school and had never stopped taking it seriously. Elias Wren had begun the ledger in October of 1919 and had made entries in it, sometimes daily and sometimes months apart, until his death in 1961. Most of it was farm accounting: the price of a bushel of corn in 1923, the weight of a hog killed in 1934, the yield of the orchard the year the late frost took half of it. But scattered through the ledger, marked at the top of the page with a small, careful star, were recipes. Not recipes the way a cookbook writes them. Elias wrote them the way an engineer writes a specification. Salt cure for shoulder, 7 days per inch of thickness, brine at ratio noted below, water drawn from spring, temperature held between 38 and 42 degrees Fahrenheit by damp in the chimney at dusk. Cold smoke, hickory and apple in equal parts, no flame permitted to reach the chamber, duration not less than 72 hours. There were 16 starred entries in all. The 11th, dated December of 1937, was titled simply, "Turkey, the Right Way." Hannah read it 3 times. Then she read it a 4th time with a pencil in her hand, making notes in her own small notebook. And when Inez came in at 9 to bank the stove for the night, she found Hannah still at the kitchen table with the ledger open and the notebook filling up, and Inez did not ask what she was doing. Inez just said, "Don't stay up too late," and went to bed. In the days that followed, Hannah walked out to the stone chamber every morning and stood inside it with the door open and studied the way the light came through the vents Elias had cut high in the north wall. She measured the interior. She checked the damper on the chimney and found it still moved, stiff but true, on its hand-forged pivot. She swept the clay floor. She built a small test fire in the firebox that sat outside the chamber and fed its smoke in through a stone channel that ran 10 feet underground so the smoke arrived cool. And she stood inside the chamber with a thermometer and watched the temperature climb from 58 degrees to 61 over the course of 2 hours, and hold there, cool as a cellar, thick with the smell of hickory. She wrote the number down. She wrote everything down. By the middle of June, she had a working understanding of what her great-grandfather had built and why. And she understood something else, too, which was that nobody in the county and probably nobody in the state was making cured smoked turkey the way Elias Wren had made it in 1937. The industry did not do it. The industry brined its turkeys in an afternoon and smoked them hot in 6 hours and sold them as holiday convenience. What Elias had done took 3 weeks from live bird to finished product and required a chamber built into a bank and a spring that ran cold in August and a man patient enough to check a thermometer every 4 hours for 72 hours straight. Hannah had the chamber. She had the spring. She was beginning to suspect, the patience. What she did not have in the middle of June, with Thanksgiving 5 months away, was a bird. And that was why, 3 weeks later, she was standing at the rail of the Millers Creek livestock yard letting Wallace Coburn laugh at her while she bought 150 broad-breasted white poults for $75 cash. She hauled them home in the back of the truck in wire crates, and Inez came out on the porch and looked at the crates and looked at Hannah and said, "So that's what you've been reading about." Hannah said, "Yes, ma'am." Inez said, "Your great-grandfather started with 6. Hannah said, "I know. I read it." I read. Inez nodded once and went back inside and came out 10 minutes later with a pair of leather gloves and helped Hannah move the poults into the empty section of the barn Hannah had cleaned and lined with fresh straw the week before. They worked without talking for 2 hours, and when the last bird was in, and the water fountains were filled and the heat lamps were hung, Inez stood at the barn door and looked at the pen full of white birds and said, "They'll need shade by August, or you'll lose a quarter of them." Hannah said, "I'm building a run into the woodlot tomorrow." Inez said, "Good." Then she went to make supper. The next morning, Hannah drove into town for feed and fence staples, and at the co-op, she ran into Wallace Coburn at the counter. He looked at her invoice and whistled. "Feeding those birds already," he said. She said, "They eat." He said, "You know they'll cost you more in feed by October than you'll ever get back at sale." She said, "That's one approach." He laughed, not unkindly but not kindly either, and said, "I'll be interested to hear how it goes." She said, "I'll let you know." Word traveled fast in a county where the co-op counter was the closest thing to a newspaper. By the end of the week, everybody from West Jefferson to Todd knew that the Wren girl had bought 150 turkeys in July, and opinions were freely offered at the feed store, at the gas station, at the little diner on Highway 194, where the men gathered for breakfast. The kindest opinion was that she was young and grieving and needed something to do. The unkindest was that 4 years in the Army had scrambled her sense of a dollar. Nobody, as far as Hannah could tell from the pieces that made their way back to her through Inez and the mail carrier and the girl at the gas station who liked her, guessed what she was actually doing. Which was fine. She had not told anyone. She built the shade run into the woodlot in 3 days, driving locust posts into the red clay and stringing woven wire between them. And she moved the birds out under the oaks, where the temperature dropped 10 degrees in the shade, and the ground was cool, and the birds could scratch through leaf litter for beetles and grit. She fed them a mix of cracked corn and roasted soybean and the mineral supplement Elias had specified in the ledger, which she had to special order from a mill in Pennsylvania because nobody within 200 miles carried it anymore. She lost 4 birds in the first week to heat stress and none after that. By the end of July, they were feathering out, big-footed and awkward and loud, and Hannah walked among them twice a day and watched them and made notes and did not name them. She held that line. She almost held that line. There was one Tom, larger than the rest, and slightly lame in the left leg from an injury he had come with, who followed her at the fence when she walked past, and she caught herself one August evening scratching his neck through the wire and calling him, in her own head, the General. She stopped scratching his neck after that, but she did not stop noticing him. August was hot and dry, and the creek dropped to a trickle, but the spring held, cold and steady, and Hannah began the second half of her preparation. She cleaned the stone chamber down to bare stone with a stiff brush and a bucket of lye water. She rehung the door with new leather hinges she cut and oiled herself. She built a stack of hickory and apple wood, split small and seasoned 2 years, and covered it with a tarp against the weather. She ordered 40 pounds of coarse gray sea salt from a supplier in Charleston, and 20 pounds of Demerara sugar, and a case of whole black peppercorns, and a smaller case of juniper berries. And when Inez saw the invoices on the kitchen table, she raised her eyebrows and said, "You're serious about this?" Hannah said, "Yes, ma'am, I am." Inez said, "Your great-grandfather would be pleased." Then she said, "He would not tell you so, but he would be." September came in cool and wet, and the birds put on weight fast. Hannah weighed a sample of 10 every Sunday and wrote the numbers in her notebook, and by the 3rd week of September, the average Tom was 24 pounds live weight, and the average hen was 15, and Hannah began to think in earnest about the schedule. Elias had written that the birds must be finished on pasture for the last 4 weeks, no corn in the last 2, only greens and grubs and what they could find, to firm the flesh and clear the fat of feed taste. She had planted a half-acre of turnips and rape in August specifically for this, and now she opened the gate and let the birds into it, and they went at the greens like they had been waiting all their lives for exactly this meal. She cut their grain ration in half and then to nothing, and she watched their droppings clear and their bodies tighten, and she knew, in the way you know a thing when you have watched it every day for 4 months, that they were going to be right. In the first week of October, Hannah drove into town and stopped at the little print shop next to the courthouse and had 200 simple cards printed. They said, "Wren Farm Heritage smoked turkey, cured and cold smoked by hand from a 1937 recipe, available for Thanksgiving, limited quantity, and a phone number," which was the landline at the farmhouse. She did not put a price on the card because she had not decided on a price. She took the cards to the co-op and the gas station and the diner and the little grocery in West Jefferson, and at each place she asked politely if she could leave a small stack by the register. And at each place the person behind the counter looked at the card and looked at her and said, "Some version of 'Sure, honey, we'll put them out.'" At the diner, the owner, a woman named Roselle, who had known Hannah's mother in high school, read the card twice and said, "Cold smoked." Hannah said, "Yes, ma'am." Roselle said, "My daddy used to talk about a turkey his uncle made one Thanksgiving in the 40s. He said it ruined every other turkey he ever ate." Hannah said, "That might have been my great-grandfather." Roselle looked up sharp. "Elias Wren," she said. Hannah said, "Yes, ma'am." Roselle put the stack of cards on the counter next to the register and set a little rock on top of them so they would not blow, and she said, "I want 2. Hannah said, "I have not set a price yet." Roselle said, "When you do, I want 2, and put me at the top of the list." That was the first order. It was October the 4th. By October the 10th, Hannah had 11 orders. By October the 20th, she had 34. She had settled on a price of $80 for a hen and $110 for a tom, which was 3 times what a supermarket bird cost, and which she had arrived at by taking her total cost and dividing by the number of birds and doubling it, and then adding a little more because Inez, when consulted, had squinted at her calculation and said, "If you don't charge enough, people won't believe it's any good." Wallace Coburn heard about the price at the co-op and laughed so hard he had to sit down on a sack of layer pellets. $110 for a turkey, he said to anyone who would listen. She's lost her mind. That girl has lost her mind. He said it at the diner, and Roselle refilled his coffee and said nothing. And he said it at the gas station, and the GIRL behind the counter, whose name was Marley and who was 17 and had ideas of her own, said nothing and slid one of Hannah's cards across the counter to a woman from Boone who was filling up on her way through. The woman read the card and put it in her purse. Marley did not mention this to Wallace Coburn. She did not mention it to anybody. She just kept sliding cards across the counter to people who looked, to her practiced eye, like they might be the kind who would pay for something made slow. By the end of October, Hannah had 91 orders and had stopped answering the phone during supper because it rang steadily from 6 to 8 every evening. Inez took to answering it herself, in the flat, unhurried voice of a woman who had negotiated with cattle buyers for 40 years, and she would write the name and the number and the size preference on a yellow legal pad she kept beside the phone, and she would say, "We will confirm your order by the 15th of November. Thank you for calling." Then she would hang up and go back to her chair and pick up her mending as if nothing had happened. Hannah watched her do this one evening and said, "You're enjoying this." Inez said, "I am not." Then after a moment she said, "Some." On the last day of October, Hannah began the harvest. She had built a small clean shed at the edge of the woodlot for the kill-in and dressing, with a cold water line run from the spring and a scalding tank heated by a propane burner and a set of stainless steel tables she had bought at auction from a shuttered processor over in Wilkes County. She had studied the humane slaughter guidelines, and she had practiced on 2 of the smaller hens the week before to be sure her hand was steady, and it was. She worked alone for the first 3 days, and then Inez came out on the 4th day in an apron and a pair of rubber boots and said, "You'll wear yourself out," and picked up a knife without being asked. They killed and dressed 12 birds a day. Hannah would not do more because the chamber could only hold that many at a time in the first stage of the cure, and because rushing was the one thing Elias had underlined twice in the ledger. "Do not rush," he had written. "The bird will tell you when it's ready. Hurry it, and you have made an ordinary thing." Each bird was weighed and tagged and rubbed with the salt cure Elias had specified, coarse gray salt and demerara sugar and cracked pepper and juniper crushed in a mortar, and then laid on a slatted wooden rack in the cool of the stone chamber with the door shut and the chimney damped. Hannah checked the temperature every 4 hours, day and night, for the first week. She slept on a cot in the tack room of the barn so she would not have to walk from the house at 2 in the morning, and Inez brought her coffee at dawn and did not comment on the arrangement. After the salt cure, each bird was rinsed in cold spring water and hung to dry for 24 hours, and then moved to the smoke side of the chamber, where the cold smoke from hickory and apple crept in through the underground stone channel and surrounded the birds at a temperature that never climbed above 72 degrees. They smoked for 72 hours. Hannah tended the firebox herself, feeding it small pieces of seasoned wood every 40 minutes so the smoke stayed steady and thin. And she read Elias's ledger by lantern light while she worked and made her own notes in her own notebook and began, without quite meaning to feel like she was working alongside a man who had been dead for 63 years. On the 4th of November, Wallace Coburn drove up the gravel road to the Wren farm in his good truck. He had never been to the Wren farm before. He parked at the top of the drive and got out slowly, a big man in his 60s in a clean canvas coat, and he stood for a moment looking at the barn and the spring house and the smoke rising thin and blue from the chimney of the stone chamber behind the smokehouse. Hannah came out of the killing shed wiping her hands on a towel and saw him and walked over. "Mr. Coburn," she said. He said, "Hannah." He did not say anything else for a moment. Then he said, "My wife's sister was over from Winston last weekend. She had heard about your turkeys from somebody at her church. She wants me to order one." Hannah said, "I have a waiting list." He nodded. He looked at the ground. He looked at the chimney. He said, "I owe you an apology." She said, "No, sir, you don't." He said, "I do. I said things at the sale I had no business saying." She said, "You said what everybody was thinking. That's not the same as being cruel." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw in the set of his mouth a man who had been prepared to make a speech and had discovered he did not need to. He said, "Put my sister-in-law down for a tom." Hannah said, "I can do that." He said, "And put me down for one too." She said, "Yes, sir." He turned to go, and then he turned back, and he said, "Your great-grandfather. Did he really do this?" She said, "Yes, sir. It's all in his ledger." Coburn nodded once slowly and said, "My daddy used to say Elias Wren was the most stubborn man in 3 counties. I think I understand now what he meant by that." Then he got in his truck and drove down the gravel road and did not make a large production out of any of it. Hannah went back to the killing shed. Inez was standing in the door with a knife in her hand. Inez said, "That was Wallace Coburn." Hannah said, "Yes, ma'am." Inez said, "Did he apologize?" Hannah said, "In his way." Inez said, "Good." Then she went back to work. By the 10th of November, 138 birds had been killed and dressed and moved through the first stage of the cure. 12 birds Hannah held back. She held back the general, whom she had never scratched again through the fence but whom she recognized on sight. And she held back 11 of the largest and most even-feathered toms, because she had decided, without discussing it with anyone including herself, that she would keep a small breeding flock for the following year. She built a separate pen for them at the far end of the woodlot with a small shelter and a windbreak, and she moved them in on the 11th of November and stood at the fence and watched them settle, and she felt, for the first time since she had come home, that she was living inside a plan she had not made and had not needed to make, because the plan had been waiting for her in a green cloth ledger for 87 years. On the 15th of November, she made the confirmation calls. She called every name on the yellow legal pad in order, and she said, "This is Hannah Wren. Your turkey will be ready for pickup on Tuesday the 26th. Between 8 in the morning and 6 in the evening, we are on Little Bear Road 3 miles past the fire station. Please bring cash or a check. Thank you for your order." She made 91 calls in 2 days. She wrote down the pickup times each customer preferred and organized them on a chart on the kitchen wall. Inez watched her work and said, "You were made for this." Hannah said, "I don't know about that." Inez said, "I do." On the 20th of November, the birds came out of the chamber. Hannah opened the oak door in the cool of the morning, and the smell that came out was unlike anything she had ever smelled in her life. It was not the smell of a supermarket smoked turkey, which is sweet and shallow and a little chemical. It was deeper than that. It was the smell of hickory and apple and salt and something meaty and clean underneath. The smell of a thing that had been made slowly by people who had time and knew what they were doing. She stood in the doorway and breathed it in, and did not move for a full minute. Then she went in and began carrying the birds out one by one, and hanging them from the rafters of the spring house to bloom for the last 24 hours in the cold air off the spring. When she was finished, 138 cured smoked turkeys hung in rows in the spring house, mahogany-skinned and firm and beautiful, and Hannah stood in the doorway and looked at them and felt something she had not felt since she had come home, which was a small, clean pride that did not need anybody else to see it to be real. Inez came down from the house at noon with 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and they sat on the stone step of the spring house and ate together and did not speak. When they were finished, Inez wiped her mouth on her handkerchief and said, "Your great-grandfather is pleased." Hannah said, "You keep saying that." Inez said, "That is because it keeps being true." On the 22nd of November, 2 days before the first pickups were scheduled to begin, the phone rang at the farmhouse at 8 in the morning. Inez answered it and listened for a long moment, and then held out the receiver to Hannah and said, "It's a man from Charlotte. He says he writes for a magazine." The man's name was David Bramwell, and he wrote for a food magazine that Hannah had never heard of, but that Inez, who read more than she let on, had. He had been given Hannah's number by a chef in Asheville whose sister-in-law had bought one of her cards at the gas station in West Jefferson 3 weeks before, and had described the turkey she had ordered in enough detail that the chef had gotten on the phone to the writer within the hour. Bramwell wanted to drive up the next day and watch the pickups and write a short piece. Hannah said, "I don't have time to be interviewed, Mr. Bramwell. I have 91 turkeys to hand out over 2 days. He said, "I don't need you to be interviewed. I just need to stand in a corner and watch." She thought about it for a moment. She said, "You can stand in a corner, but you cannot get in the way, and you cannot photograph my grandmother without asking her, and she will say no." He said, "Understood." He drove up from Charlotte the next morning in a small, clean car, and he stood in the corner of the spring house for 2 days and watched, and he did not get in the way, and he did not photograph Inez, and he wrote down in a small leather notebook the things he saw. He saw a young woman in a green work shirt hand a mahogany-skinned turkey wrapped in butcher paper to a farmer from Sparta, who paid in cash from a fold of bills in his shirt pocket and did not haggle. He saw a woman drive up from Winston-Salem in a station wagon with 3 children in the back and pay for 2 toms with a check and shake Hannah's hand and say, "My mother-in-law is going to weep when she sees these." He saw Wallace Coburn arrive at 4 in the afternoon on the second day and stand in line behind a young couple from Boone and wait his turn without complaint. And he saw Coburn take his turkey and pay in cash and say to Hannah quietly, "This is the best money I have spent in 5 years," and walk out with the bird cradled in both arms like it was a child. He saw Inez Wren, whom he did not photograph, sitting on a stool in the corner of the spring house with the yellow legal pad in her lap, crossing off names as birds went out the door, wearing men's work boots without self-consciousness. He saw 138 turkeys leave the farm in 2 days, and he saw the last customer, a woman from Blowing Rock who had driven 45 miles, cry a little when she smelled her bird through the paper. He saw Hannah lock the spring house door at 6 in the evening on the 27th of November and lean against it for a moment with her eyes closed. He wrote all of it down. On Thanksgiving Day, Hannah and Inez ate the general. Hannah had killed him last, on the 12th of November, and had cured and smoked him separately in a small batch of 1, and she had held him back from every order and every list. He weighed 19 pounds finished. Inez roasted him low and slow in the wood stove in the kitchen with nothing on him but a rub of butter and black pepper, because Elias had written in the ledger that a properly cured and smoked bird needed nothing else. And when Inez pulled him out at 2 in the afternoon, the kitchen filled with a smell that stopped Hannah where she stood. They ate at the kitchen table with a bowl of mashed potatoes and a bowl of turnip greens and a jar of Inez's chow-chow and a bottle of hard cider Hannah had traded a neighbor for a week before. Inez cut the first slice and put it on Hannah's plate and said, "Taste it." Hannah tasted it. She did not say anything for a long moment. Inez said, "Well." Hannah said, "It's the best thing I have ever put in my mouth." Inez said, "Your great-grandmother said the same thing in 1937. Then Inez cut a slice for herself and tasted it and closed her eyes and did not open them for a long time. And when she opened them, there was something in them Hannah had not seen before, which was the look of a woman who had waited 63 years to taste a specific thing again and had found it exactly as she remembered. They ate slowly. They did not talk much. When they were finished, Inez pushed her plate away and said, "Hannah." Hannah said, "Yes, ma'am." Inez said, "I want you to know something." Hannah said, "Yes, ma'am." Inez said, When your grandfather Coleman died, I thought the farm would die with me. I thought there would not be a wren on this ridge after I was gone. I made my peace with that. I did not like it, but I made my peace with it. And then you came home." Hannah did not say anything. Inez said, "I am not going to make a large speech. I'm just going to say that I am glad." Then she got up and cleared the plates and would not let Hannah help. That night Hannah sat at the kitchen table with the green ledger open and the yellow legal pad beside it, and she added up what she had made. 91 orders at an average of $95 a bird came to $8,645. Her costs for the year, including the $75 for the poults and the feed and the salt and the wood and the printing and the phone and the propane and the tags and the paper and the incidentals, came to $2,311. She had cleared $6,334 on 138 birds in 4 months of work. It was not a fortune. It was not going to make her rich. But it was more than double what she had spent, and she had 12 breeding birds in the woodlot, and she had a chamber and a spring and a ledger and a grandmother, and she realized as she sat there with a pencil in her hand, a life. In the first week of December, David Bramwell's article was published. It was 3 pages long with 2 photographs, one of the stone chamber at dusk and one of a mahogany-skinned turkey hanging in the spring house, and it was titled, quietly, "The Turkey That Was Waiting." It described a young veteran who had come home to her grandmother's ridge farm in Ashe County, North Carolina, and had found in a green cloth ledger the recipe her great-grandfather had brought back from France in 1919, and had spent 4 months proving that the overlooked way was the right way. It did not mention Wallace Coburn by name. It did not need to. It quoted Hannah once, saying, "I did not invent any of this. I just read what was written down." It quoted Inez not at all, because Inez had refused to be quoted, but it described her in one line as a woman who wore men's work boots without self-consciousness because she had earned the right. The magazine hit newsstands on a Tuesday. By Friday, the phone at the farmhouse was ringing every 20 minutes. By the following Tuesday, Hannah had a waiting list of 400 names for the next Thanksgiving, and she was still 11.5 months away from having a single bird ready. She sat at the kitchen table with the yellow legal pad, which had grown to 3 legal pads, and she looked at Inez and said, "I can't do 400. Inez said, "No, you cannot." Hannah said, "The chamber only holds 12 at a time in the first stage." Inez said, "Then you do 200, and you do them the same way, and you tell the other 200 to call back next year." Hannah said, "They will be angry." Inez said, "Some of them. Most of them will wait. The ones who will not wait were not your customers anyway." Hannah wrote that down in her notebook. She wrote it down word for word. The second year, she raised 220 birds from the 12 she had kept back, and from a small purchase of heritage poults she drove to Pennsylvania in April to collect. Because Elias had noted in the ledger that the broad-breasted whites were a compromise, and that the older breeds, the bronzes and the Narragansetts, held the smoke better and finished with more flavor. She built a second stone chamber against the bank behind the first one. Using stone she pulled from the collapsed spring house of a neighbor who had let her have it for the hauling, and she built it slowly through the summer with her own hands and with the help of a 17-year-old boy named Caleb Hollifield, who had shown up at the gravel road one afternoon in June and asked if she needed help, and had turned out to be the kind of quiet worker Hannah recognized on sight. She paid him fair, and she taught him what she was doing, and she did not tell him he was learning something that mattered because he could see that for himself. By November of the second year, she filled 200 orders and turned away 300 more, and she raised her price to $110 for a hen and $140 for a tom, and nobody complained. Wallace Coburn drove up the gravel road again in the first week of November and stood in the yard and said, "I want to buy 3 this year," and Hannah put him down for 3. and he paid in advance in cash and would not accept a receipt. The third year, Inez died. She died in her sleep in the last week of February at the age of 83, in the bed she had shared with Coleman for 41 years, in the room she had been born in 1941. Hannah found her in the morning when she brought the coffee up. Inez had gone quietly and without struggle, and her hands were folded on the quilt her mother had pieced in 1943. And there was a small half-smile on her face that Hannah understood without needing anyone to explain it. The funeral was on a cold, clear Saturday, and half the county came. And Wallace Coburn stood at the back of the little church in a black suit and did not try to speak to Hannah, but nodded to her once across the room in a way that said everything that needed saying. They buried Inez next to Coleman in the family plot on the ridge above the orchard, in ground Elias had chosen in 1919 for exactly this purpose, and Hannah stood at the graveside in her green work shirt under a black wool coat and did not cry because Nez would not have wanted her to make a large production out of any of it. That spring, Hannah raised 300 birds. She built a third chamber. She hired Caleb full-time, and she hired his younger sister Nell to answer the phone and keep the lists. And she kept the price the same, and the method the same, and the pace the same, because Elias had written in the ledger that a thing done right at a small scale becomes a different thing at a large scale. And she believed him. She built no debt. She took no loans. She let demand pull the growth, and she let the growth stop where the chamber stopped. And when people from Raleigh and Charlotte and Atlanta called and offered to invest, she said, "Thank you. No," in the flat, unhurried voice she had learned from her grandmother, and she hung up the phone and went back to work. 4 years after the morning at the Millers Creek livestock yard on a hot Tuesday in July, Hannah drove down to the same yard to look at a lot of heritage poults a small hatchery had brought up from Tennessee. She stood at the rail in a faded green work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and she looked at the birds for a long time without saying anything. There were men at the rail she did not know, younger men, and one of them nudged another and said, "Quiet, that's the Wren woman," and they stopped talking and watched her the way you watch someone you have heard about but never seen. She raised one finger to the auctioneer and bought the lot at a fair price, and paid in cash and loaded the crates into her truck and drove home up the gravel road to the Ridge Farm, where the 2 stone chambers Elias had built and the one she had built stood in a row against the bank behind the smokehouse, and where a green cloth ledger sat on the bottom shelf of the parlor with a second notebook, bound in brown cloth, beside it now, filled with her own careful handwriting. If this story moved you, share it with someone who has been told that what they have isn't worth much. Leave a comment about a time patients proved the loud voices wrong, and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single comment. I'll see you in the next one.